I am pleased to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Vicki Kane, who is a homeowner and board president, and she has served on her condo association for the past 7 years. Vicki also serves on our education committee and is a longtime CAI member and is a member of the Maryland LAC for the past 4 years. So Vicki, thank you for being here today. Next, we have Brian Fellner, who is the founder of Fellner Legal Services. Brian provides legal services to condominium, homeowners associations, and co-ops throughout Maryland and DC. And he presents to management companies, boards, and communities associations on topics that range from board of directors governance to bankruptcy and many other matters for community associations. So Brian is a very active member in our chapter, and Brian, we appreciate you being here today as well. Next, we have Phil Simmerer, who is the founder of Simmerer Insurance, which he founded in 2003. The agency has shown growth over the past, well, since every year, and has won numerous awards in the region. Phil is also a Diamond sponsor of the Chesapeake Region chapter and an active member for us as well. So Phil, thank you for taking the time to be here today. And then lastly, we have Matt Miracle. Matt is a community manager with over 10 years of experience, and he has experience managing both condominiums and homeowners associations. Matt serves on numerous numerous committees within our chapter, and he'll actually be a speaker again next week at our expo. So I'm looking forward to that. And Matt, thank you for being here as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us this morning, appreciate it. Hopefully the goal here today is to give a little bit of insight on how your community and you as a board member or active member of your community can get the most out of your professional advisors. So we're gonna give some examples of that today, hopefully give you some information on what kind of board or community that you all work with, and then hopefully give you some tips and insight on how to obtain those contractors and business professionals that you work with and help better assist your community. So there's a couple of different examples that I like to use in terms of types of associations or types of management that communities have. Stephen, if you don't mind putting up the poll, we have 3 listed here, and I'd like for everyone to try to give an answer on how they think their community or they themselves participate in the community. We have self-managed communities, passive communities, and engaged communities. After you give your response, I'm going to give a little bit of an example of each one and see if your answer still stays the same after you provide your response.
Okay, we'll just give everybody another 30 seconds here.
All right, so we got some board members, some managers, and the majority here looks like we do have a managed community. So to kind of get into it here, there are a couple of different ways that I like to define community associations. Obviously, self-managed, there's really 2 different types of self-managed communities. One where the community members take care of everything from assessment collection to their finances to obtaining contractors, and that would really be a fully self-managed community. Generally, that's those communities that are smaller. For example, the community I live in is only 40 homes, and we're self-managed. There's also the type of self-management where the board of directors does the day-to-day management in terms of obtaining contractors, working with homeowners, but they have financial assistance either from a management company or if they have another financial firm that will do collections and help them out with that. Really, those are smaller types of communities that don't have a lot of membership and don't have a lot of outside needs that need professional help. The 2 other types of communities are your passive communities and your engaged communities. And in my opinion, the majority of communities associations, whether condominium or homeowners associations, are passive. You'll have active members, meaning you'll have board of directors that really steer the way. They a lot of the community members lean on the board. Some of the characteristics of a passive committee would be just one or two board members kind of steering the ship. There's little to no community involvement in terms of homeowners being involved outside of board meetings. There's no committees, and you have really, really limited participation when you have your board of directors meetings or meetings outside of your annual budget meeting. And really, the majority of the communities that we manage fall into that category. So it's very important that those board of directors members that are steering the ship have professionals that are there to help them, whether it be their attorney, their managing agent, or their contractors. And then there's the engaged community, which is really rather limited recently. This is a community that would have every single board member very involved, multiple committees that are involved, whether it's landscaping committee, financial committee. And then outside of that, your community members are very engaged as well. Over 10% participation with your regular board meetings. You never have an issue getting quorum at your annual meetings. Unfortunately, recently, as I'm sure a lot of you can attest to, there's not very many engaged communities that are around because it takes a lot of effort and it's a volunteer position for a lot of people. So I don't think a lot of the communities that we manage are really falling to that engaged community, except for one that's on today. Vicki Kane is a community we manage in Baltimore, and they're very, very active, both the board as well as the community members. So with that information, did we have another poll in terms of what we're going to do with that, Stephen?
No, it's just the one.
Now, with that information, in terms of which community that you fall into, I would assume that the majority of the people on the call today would fall into that passive role. Not you yourself, but your community members and the assistance that you get from the community. You probably are a leader within your community, or you're a community manager that works with passive communities. And hopefully some of the information we can give you some assistance on what you'll need to do to get help from your business partners. So some of the business partners that we think that all communities would need to work with, there's a listing here. And what we have is your attorney, your auditor, reserve specialist, management, obviously, if you're a managed community, would be the management partner, contractors, insurance, pest control, and environmental. But there's several others. And if, Stephen, if you don't mind, I'd like to open up to some questions here to see if there's any things within the last year that anyone on this call today has had to deal with. For example, engineering firms that you've all have had to deal with since the issues that have come up in Florida, or IT professionals to allow your communities to do more webinars and IT work. So if there's anyone on the call today that can give an example of another expert that you've had to use personally, maybe we can get into some more information on that.
So Matt, I'll chime in as a homeowner. With all the storms we had the last couple months, we had several trees struck by lightning, and we're now in the process of our HOA of dealing with finding folks to come in and remove very large trees from our association. So that was one expert that we've had to deal with.
All right. Anyone else? Did everyone have their coffee this morning? Since I started talking. No?
Since I'm working on my coffee, Matt, I'll chime in also and say that another seasonal one that pops up a lot of the time is that snow removal. We're coming up towards that time of the year, and a lot of the times associations will find out only after the fact or only as it comes up that person isn't necessarily in place, and by that point it's too late. It's like trying to book your place down at Ocean City right on June 1st. You have to be in there a little bit ahead of time and make sure that you have that roster set up.
All right. Anyone else on the call? Vicki, can you give any examples that we've had to use in the last year at the towers?
Well, I think the one big one, which we kind of scrambled for, is we're not an HOA, we're a condo. And we are 4 buildings. And because of COVID, with the last minute, if someone mentioned to management that they were testing positive, we had to come up with very quickly a company that could help us mitigate any of the possibilities of the spread of infection, because we have common hallways, we have a common mail room, the back hallways. So there were commonalities. And for that, it was kind of a last minute scramble. We also had recently a situation with a very large water main break, which I think we'll talk about later. And our primary contractor wasn't going to be available for 3 weeks, and we couldn't let the driveway flood for 3 weeks. So those are all kind of things that you think are never going to happen, but they do.
So for each one of these types of experts that are needed, really, we recommend vetted contractors, vetted professionals. And really, there are a lot of resources out there in terms of how to find those. But there are also obstacles that you run into in terms of obtaining a roster of experts and changing experts that you've worked with for years. Generally, your attorney, your management company, your insurance agency, those are larger contractors that you've had a very long experience with generally. And trying to change that takes a lot of work from both the community members as well as board members. Some of the other general contractors that you work with that you'll send out RFPs for, your plumbers, your general handyman, things, roof work, things like that. It's a little bit easier to have a longer roster of experts that you'll work with. But if you're in a community association or your manager that's worked with an attorney for a long extended period of time with your community, and your community wants to make a change, it's a rather long process. For example, for a collections attorney, you need to determine what type of collections are being done, if you have the ability to transfer clients over, and other pertinent information that your management company and that your community has to work with. So the further along we get into the process here, we'll explain some of the processes of how to obtain those contractors and some of the ways to find really vetted experts that'll help your community. All right, Brian, I'll turn it over to you in terms of consequences of not having a vetted expert. And
so some of the things that you can run up against there is if you have, for instance, either an attorney or an insurance specialist or several other contractors who aren't familiar with the community association world and the way that things get done there, then a lot of the times you can get, even though that person is well-meaning, well-informed, a good relationship with you, they may give you not the most up-to-date legal advice, insurance advice, guidance on those processes, and that can be something. It's a cost issue a lot of the time. You try to get set up with that professional, you utilize them, and then it turns out that what they advised you or what they gave you isn't necessarily the right way, and you're going to have to spend even more money to turn around and correct those issues. There also are potential liability problems if you use, for instance, an unlicensed contractor, especially in Maryland where the MHIC is an issue. And if you use any of those contractors, then you may have an issue in terms of protection for liability and proper insurance coverage on their end as well. So there are a lot of different consequences. It's a very important issue to make sure that you're using not just somebody, but a vetted expert, who you've done your due diligence on. So.
Okay, so the question becomes, when should an expert be consulted? And in a self-managed community, obviously it's when there's a question in the association that goes beyond the board's knowledge. Now, you may have some industry experts on your board, but generally speaking, the majority of board members are probably retired, and they may not necessarily have knowledge of current laws, regulations, everything else. And they may say, okay, I know this guy. And that may not always be enough. You need to really go and self-managed community in this area. There's a lot more work than you would think, because, well, you may know one guy, but then how do you find somebody else? Do you just go through the yellow pages? Do you ask around? You don't have any basis for the expertise that you may need. Now, in a managed community, after what you do first is you discuss the situation. And we are a managed community, but we pretty much do a lot of it ourselves. And what happens is we discuss the situation with our community manager, get their suggestions and combine them with people we know. We happen to have we're fortunate, we have a lot of expertise on our board, and that helps. And the only time that it doesn't always work is if it's an emergency, which I had mentioned earlier. We had one recently and it was an emergency, and it didn't quite go the way we wanted it to go, because it was a weekend and it was a really mess, but we've managed to fix it. It's okay, it's just going to cost us. So these are the things you really have to think about. We are a board that came from being pretty much a self-managed community because we couldn't find a management company that could adequately deal with our needs. So we did most of it ourselves and then told the management company after the fact that this is what we were doing. Our current management company is such that they've got good ideas. They have a list of contractors, and we consider them along with our internal people. And quite frankly, most of the time, they've been right. So that's a kind of situation that helps us get our vendors. And then, of course, you've always got the issues where maybe something's going to go wrong. And Bill, do you want to address that?
There we go. So we're talking about when things go wrong. The insurance, obviously, a lot of people think is going to be there, and it's going to be there for a lot of things that can go wrong. Slip and falls are very common, and that is where the general liability is going to provide the legal defense and any legal liability. I think where a lot of associations, I've seen almost everybody has when they have insurance, they have the general liability. A lot of people think that's, all they need. The directors and officers is another big piece. And then the umbrella is where most people are missing. So when things go wrong from the insurance side of things, it's important to have those conversations with your agent to make sure that he understands all the needs of your association, so that when things go wrong, if it's something that insurance is going to cover, that you have what you need.
And the
Vicky,
managed community paradigm there is really a good model for self-managed communities to use as well. What Vicky and Matt both talked about is that a situation arises, and in a managed community, you're going to talk to your association manager who knows the lay of the land, who knows where this goes, who knows at least who we're referring it to if it's not within their realm to handle, if it's not something that they can just take care of right there in-house. And so that's that sort of funnel, that checkpoint where they say, nope, this goes to legal. Nope, this goes to insurance. Nope, this goes to, we need to go get an outside company to handle this number of trees because we don't have anybody on staff, certified for that who's an arborist or anything else that covers that. And so when you are sitting in a self-managed community, it's a great idea to think about it that same way, to say, when we sit down, hey, if we had a manager, or among us, are we able to knock this out? Do we have the expertise on hand already? Or is this something where we need to go get an outside opinion, an outside interpretation of our insurance policy, or a contractor who can handle this matter?
Okay, if we go on to the next slide. Okay, who should be consulted? And we kind of covered that in the previous one because the two of them go together. They're actually pretty much one and the same. in a self-managed community, mostly it's referrals. I mean, they may be the easiest, but they're not always the best. In managed communities, as we've been mentioning, the community manager has recommendations because they have a larger list of networks, because they've dealt with more people and experts, things that, you know, people that you're not always sure of could be within a self-managed community. You may have 2 or 3. If you're dealing with a managed community of any kind, you probably have a minimum of 3 people. Our policy is that before we make any decisions, we have to have 3. That's just the way it's always been since before I've been on the board. And it's a policy that has really worked to our benefit. And I think we've got a poll here. And the poll is, can the board use referrals from other members of the board or homeowners of the association? So let's see what our poll comes up with here.
Sorry, all, I'm getting an error in Zoom about the poll. Give me 1 second. If not, folks can feel free to add the comment in the chat box. Let me try one more time. I've never seen this error before. Okay, so I apologize. It looks like our poll's not going to launch, but maybe if folks could toss answers into the chat box. Vicki, could you repeat the question one more time?
The question is, can the board use referrals from other members of the board or homeowners in the association? Now we'll do a little Jeopardy music. Okay. All right, so Phil came up with a yes. Do we have anybody else? And Janet said yes. So, you know, we're going along with this. And that kind of leads into the next slide very nicely. And I'm going to turn it over to Phil on how do we find good advisors?
Well, I think we've been, is my mute on? Okay, I think we've been talking a lot about, you know, where already. For self-managed, I think it's the hardest because obviously you don't have a manager who has that roster. So hopefully over time, I mean, if you're a brand new community and you're starting out self-managed, I think that's going to be difficult. Hopefully, you know, there has been a roster of advisors, you know, over time. I was going to use the rule of 3 also. Vicki brought that up. I mean, you need to talk to a minimum of 3, and I would say 3 reputable ones. And you know, how do you know if they're reputable? Well, I think common sense comes into play. Having a good request for proposal RFP is important to make sure that you're asking all of them for the same things. And that way, you know, you can compare, you know, the apples to apples, obviously, and get a better sense for who you think is going to be a better fit for what your needs are. The CAI has a directory of folks that are out there for anybody to access. You know, those are people who are committed, obviously, to the community association industry and supporting it. And so it's a great place to go. And there's, you know, definitely more than 3 in every category when you go to those directories. And then, you know, lastly, we've already talked about, you know, homeowners, you know, why not keep it in-house or keep it local? You know, if you're getting bids, why not submit that RFP to one of those people that were referred to you by a homeowner or somebody else that you knew? I think the key thing is to have, you know, a minimum number of bids. You're getting, you know, asking everybody for the same things, and then you know, use common sense. Go from there. The same kind of thing you would do for your own home, I hope. And
Phil, if you don't mind me jumping in here.
Yeah, please.
One of the things that we find when we've taken over communities that are self-managed is dealing with contractors that sometimes may fall into the category of a conflict of interest with the community. I found personally with my community that I'm living in currently, when I moved in, we had both a landscaping contractor and a preferred roof contractor that was a member of the community. and all of the work that was getting bid out was going directly to them. So those self-managed communities, as well as community members, communities that are managed, need to make sure that they're very diligent in making sure there's not a conflict of interest. Now, there may be a member of your community or a contractor that lives within your community that's the best fit, that's been bid out and has been vetted. But everyone on this call, both managers as well as homeowners, need to be very careful in terms of falling into that line, whether it's optics or if it's really a conflict of interest where a homeowner is directly benefiting from a contractor being on site.
Right. I mean, I would add to that. You have to have a higher standard, for that person, because you don't, like you said, optics. You don't want anybody, making accusations. It's almost like you want to be inclusive, but at the same time, you have to be very careful of that, because it can really come back to bite you.
It's a great point. And from a legal perspective, a lot of the times these community association documents will have a provision in them that says something about a common or interested director, somebody who already is on the board of directors or is on a committee, but now is also bidding for one of these jobs, or who has been retained for one of these jobs. And at the very least, those provisions always require disclosure. So that has to be put out there to the owners. If you're on this call and you're an owner and you haven't looked at your documents in a while, and this is a concern for you in the association, I suggest that you go back and take a look at your documents, because it's highly likely that that provision is in there somewhere. So you want to make sure that you are disclosing these things as well, regardless of, if it comes down to it's a conflict and they can't do it. That's what Matt is suggesting. That's step one, make sure it's not that. But if it's okay and they're the best one and they've been bid out, but they're an interested director as well as bidding on this project, you got to disclose it. You got to make sure that the owners are aware of this, and that is also your legal obligation.
One other thing that I would like to add, and you'll excuse me, our general landscape people are here today, so you may hear a lawnmower in the background. One thing that I think both self-managed and managed communities tend to forget about is the use of a good RFP, apples to apples. And I cannot emphasize how important that is. Generally speaking, before the last several years, we would ask vendors for a proposal. And then we would try and sit there with 3 or 4 proposals and a pen trying to figure out this is this and this is this, until we got a format. And we got a format from our current management committee, our management company, on how to really structure an RFP. So now we send the RFP to everybody, and we make the vendor structure their proposal to the format in our RFP. And I cannot emphasize how much time that has saved us in trying to look at apples to apples. So if you're self-managed or managed, and I would think self-managed would probably get more benefit out of this, you really have to send them an RFP with what you need, what time, item by item by item by item. That way, when they come back, their small print is all relegated to the bottom. They answer your questions, and it's better than having them show up on site for an interview. And with those RFPs, you can take 5 or 6 and narrow it down to 2 or 3 or 4 in a relatively short period of time, because they know what you're looking for and they have replied specifically to your requirements.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, I think, there we go. Phil, it's you again.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar here with managed communities. Obviously the management company they're going to have their own roster, as Matt pointed out, of the preferred vetted vendors that they use, as well well as advisors. And again, with the request for proposals, those are extremely important, as Vicky was certainly pointing out. You know, it's self-managed. You know, we keep pointing out it's a little bit harder to have those people, and so you have to be more diligent and take more time. Maybe the number isn't three, Vicky said. If you have a list of people, when you have a good RFP, you're putting that together one time. You could submit it to 5, 6, 7, you know, see how many, and then narrow it down based on that, and then, you know, making sure that you're interviewing those advisors, and especially when it comes to insurance and legal and accounting, people that are you're hoping to not, those aren't the kind of relationships you really want to be, you know, they're more long-term relationships. So it takes more time to develop those, determine who you want to stick with. So it's not something you do overnight, in other words. What else?
Bill, it sounds like your headset might be cutting in and out a little bit. I'm just not sure. I know there's probably not a whole lot you can do with this, so maybe just try projecting as much as possible and see if it maybe catches it just a little bit better.
Okay. Is there background noise?
No, I think it's just your mic. It might not just be like catching, like I'm not sure if it's directional or what, but if you could just project. I know there's probably not as much we can do with it, so just
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, that's.
Well, I was hoping. Does anybody else have something to add then? If my mic isn't working, is that great?
So in terms of RFPs and helping to develop them, one of the things that we try to direct our communities to when developing the RFP, and Phil and Brian could probably attest to this too, is making sure that the contractors that you're working with, beyond being vetted, have the proper insurance coverage and language in their contracts to protect the community. One of the things that we've run into recently is we have contractors that are very willing and able to do the job, but they'll just have general liability and not the other insurance that's necessary to do work in your associations. So if you have a contractor that's coming on site that has multiple employees, they have vehicles, they need all those coverages, and they need to be very clear about that when they're coming onto your property. And Phil and Brian, you probably can elaborate on this, but if your contractor has a lapse of coverage or a lack of coverage when they're working on your property, your association may have some liability. Brian, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's entirely correct. And as Phil will probably tell you, you want to get those additional insured certificates where possible, you know, have the association named right there on the policy, so that if something comes up, you can make a direct claim. That's a huge step removed out from the middle. If you have a contractor who, for whatever reason, causes some damage, monetary damage or loss, or there's a need for remediation there, and that contractor is slow, stubborn, can't do it, doesn't want to submit to their insurance company for any reason, and you are the named additional insured, that can remove that whole question, and that can really give you the opportunity to proceed and recover. And then in terms of making sure that the policy really covers and the policy limits cover what you're talking about, and for a big facade project versus a small, you know, resealing the parking lot, you have to make sure that the policy limits really reflect the risks that are brought on by that particular task or that particular project.
Right, and not just and make sure they have all the policies they need as well, because workers' compensation will fall back to the association if the contractor doesn't have coverage and their employee gets injured. Next thing you know, the association's facing the Workers' Compensation Commission to pay for that person's medical bills and lost wages. And so you have to ask for a certificate of insurance from every contractor naming the association as additional insured, and then make sure that they have not just the general liability, but also the workers' compensation. And good contractors are going to have that umbrella coverage as well, that excess liability, which is going to cover those unfortunate larger losses that can occur. So very good point to bring up. I see so many times I talk to property managers, I'm asking them as we're bidding on an association, you know, make sure that, you know, the community is getting certificates from every single contractor, every year, not just the first time, but you have to get those every year because insurance policies renew. And I can't tell you how many times, I've been told that they're not getting those. And even if they are getting them, the certificates may or may not be naming the association as additional insured. So that is crucial, because it all falls back to you as a board member. If those things, and it's a volunteer position, so you really got to make sure you're protecting your personal liability by having getting those certificates, and not just because people think about the community having their insurance in place, and yeah, that's important, but you also, it's so critical to make sure anybody who steps on the property to do work, that they have their insurance in place.
Yeah, and just to clarify, with the majority of our RFPs, especially for larger projects, we ask for that insurance information right up front. If they're not able to supply it, they may have the best price and the best RFP out of everybody, or the best proposal out of everybody. But unfortunately, for a lot of times, that'll disqualify people. So we try to make sure that we're very upfront about it, that the contractors as well as the board members are all very clear on what's necessary for that.
Yeah, I've seen contractors have the lowest price because they don't have the insurance. So beware of that. That really low price is probably too good to be true for a reason.
And that's also something that's good to put in the RFP. This is why a consistent RFP covers everything that you think you're going to need to know. And if you don't have one, you have a management company, I'm sure they have a format, an outline you could use, or you just look at what you've got, find a really good contract, and just put down step 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the things that we need to know. And that will come up very quickly if they don't have it. And as they said, the lowest isn't necessarily the best, because you don't know, unless you have something really structured and you know everything they're providing, you don't know what they're not providing, especially since you're depending upon them for the expertise, because you don't have it, especially in a self-managed community, but in a managed community as well. If you're a managed community that depends upon your management company, you need to, before just giving them everything carte blanche, you need to look at it and say, are they following everything? Are the managers so overloaded they're forgetting things? These are things that we've looked at several times when we've looked at management companies. So it's really important to get this insurance there, because you could get stuck with a really hefty bill and not have the funding in order to take care of it. And that throws everything out of whack.
And here on the issue of relying on homeowners with expertise in different subjects, we have covered this one a little bit. We touched on it, but just some best practices here. For a self-managed community, the thing you want to keep in mind is, does their expertise really fit the bill here? There's plenty of attorneys, there's plenty of insurance agents, there's plenty of all those kinds of professions, but not all of them necessarily are familiar with what your association is doing, or keep up to date on association statutes, laws, insurance policy trends, and are paying attention to risk and loss management, those types of things. So you can certainly pay attention to those homeowners, but at the end of the day, what you want to do is identify what we've talked about: qualified subject matter experts, people who pay attention to this all the time and thus can talk to you about recent trends. They can use their full experience to your benefit. And so a professional relationship, instead of just saying, hey, Mr. Smith down the street, what do you think about this, often provides that board that extra layer of protection. It's really important to have a contractor. We've talked about contractors, whether it be any construction contractors, whether it be attorneys or other professionals like that who have that insurance in place to make sure that the association is protected if, for instance, their advice is wrong, or that there is a negative consequence that comes out of it. Regardless of all the things that we're talking about here, you can consult with all the best experts all the time, and sometimes something's still going to turn badly. And so you want to have that insurance in place. You want to have that protection that your real trusted professionals are going to have in place for you there. And we did talk about the conflict of interest and the transparency during selection process, and all of the things that were hit before are really key, because it's the appearance, it's the actual existence of any potential conflict, and then it's disclosure and making sure that you're complying with what your documents require, because your documents may mandate that you say that this person is an owner within the association. It may mandate that you say it every time you sign a new contract with them, or that they do any work within the association. You may have other legal obligations there. So not only do you have to keep in mind the appearance and the process and the actual existence of the potential disqualifiers, but any legal obligations that you have as far as disclosure is concerned.
I just had a question, and I think this would be kind of for Matt and Vicky. If you don't use, so if you have somebody on your board who has professional experience and they're very vocal about it and want to kind of donate that experience to serve the community, how do you handle when you then have to turn that person away because they might not be the best fit? Whether it's, like Brian said, that their experience might be in a different area from what the community needs, or maybe, they're just, the community wants that protection, but have you had any situations like that, and how would you handle it?
Stephen, are you segueing us into how to deal with difficult people that's coming up in a couple of weeks here? Sorry, I'll let Matt and Vicky actually answer.
That's a great question. And in all honesty, yes, we do. And we've had those situations. As I said, we're fortunate to have a couple of people on our board who have a wealth of information and experience. And they are definitely not shy about presenting it. And for the most part, they've been right. But there are times when they're wrong. And if the board, this is why we have an engaged board. The board sits there and reviews everything. And we've got the RFPs and we've got the opinion from the in-house expert. And you look at them and you're working as a board, as a group of people who can look at everything and kind of tune out that one person to see which one is the best for the community. Their experience might be great, but it might not apply to a community of your size. And that's simple enough to say, yeah, we appreciate it, but we're going to go with this one. And then the worst that happens, if this person has the experience, is they either resign from the board, which we haven't had happen yet, or if something goes wrong, they'll say, I told you so. But generally speaking, you can just deal with it the same way you would with anything. You've got your pros and your cons column, and you say, yeah, this, and this, but your guy doesn't seem to have used the best judgment, or they've been relegated to smaller communities. And you never know where this expertise is going to come from. We have one of our favorite vendors. We got their name from a homeowner who basically said we needed a lot of work done on our trees because of the ash blight in Maryland. We knew we were going to we have 13 acres. We knew a lot of trees were coming down. We were spending a lot of money, and we needed someone who was going to be really professional. And one of our homeowners said, well, why don't you try this guy? I've never used him because I don't have a house, But my boss has, and he takes care of around our business. He's taking care of our home. And we brought him in, we gave him a shot, and he's been great. And we've kept him ever since. So, you've just got to be diplomatic in the way you talk to people and say, yes, I appreciate, your experience. I appreciate this, but the majority of the board feels that we need to go in this direction. It's tough. And as I said, it could result in a board member who just decides, well, they don't listen to me, so I'm not going to run again, or I'm going to resign. That could happen. But I think if they're reasonable people and your reason for going with somebody else is good, and you've done your due diligence, and you know why you want to go with this other person, then they should be reasonable. If they're not reasonable and they decide, tough, I'm going to resign, then the question becomes, do you really want this person on the board? If they're not looking out for the entire community. So that's something you can address as well. I know we have. Matt, you have any comments?
So just to piggyback off of Vicky's point there, you do need a very strong board and a strong community, because on both ends of that spectrum, if you have a person that's an expert in a certain field, sometimes there may be a reliance on that person that allows the board to, let's say, put their guard down and say, okay, well, board member C says that this is how we should do it. This is how we should do it. Really, it takes due diligence of the board and your managing agent to make sure that you're looking at everything with an objective eye and making sure that it's the best thing for the community. And sometimes you do have to have those tough conversations. I know Vicky and I have, and I'm sure everyone on this call has, but really, if it's in this person's best interest to look out for the community, generally, after the kicking and screaming, they'll go ahead and make sure that they're okay with what the rest of the board's decided. Brian, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was going to chime in real quick and just say the best thing that you can do in this situation is vote. A lot of the times our community association boards, they're very familiar with one another. They reach a consensus a lot of the times. It's done a little bit informally where perhaps we don't even make a motion. We just kind of move forward with the suggested proceeding. And where there's a real question between board members, or if there are two options on the table, every single one of the community association documents that I've ever read, with the exception of one, which had 4 board members for some reason, but has an odd number of board members. And the reason for that is that you're going to have a vote. And if there are folks who are in the minority there, what Vicky is saying they're expected to do is say, okay, the majority rules, we're going to move forward. This is the decision the board made. And thank you very much. And so a lot of the times putting it to a vote can help in that situation.
Absolutely. So with all of our management contracts, we have very clear language on the amount that a board of director or a managing agent is allowed to approve without it going to a vote. Generally, it's around $1,000 or $1,500. And usually we use that clause for emergency work. But for all other projects, no matter how small or large, we always make sure it's a vote, either via an email that's ratified at a meeting, or if we can take time to do it, we'll do it at a board meeting. And that really takes out a lot of the issues that we were talking about here with having one board member that wants to kind of run the show, making sure that you have a vote.
Okay, so we found our expert one way or the other. So the next question becomes, how do you work with that expert? And on this one, you need to, here we go again with, you need to identify the type of relationship. For instance, with an attorney, you're going to have them, do you want them on a retainer to be there whenever you call? Or do you want them only for collections to follow up on specific items? That's also a decision that the board can make. They can look at everything and say, okay, in the past couple of years, we've needed this, this, and this. Who have we got who can do all of that? Who have we got who's got a reputation to follow up? And that's what you're looking at. If you're self-managed, then yes, it's often a direct relationship, because if you're self-managed, then it's a matter of who brought that referral into you. And then that person usually becomes the liaison. That's the person who you call, and then that person goes and talks directly to the contractor. And that's the way it's going to go. Now, let's see. All right. The other thing, and Brian has mentioned it frequently, you need to look at your governing documents. And I think, at least I found, that people are not as familiar with their governing documents as you would like. Yes, we all get a copy of them before we buy the property. How many people read them? Good question. Most do not. We've actually we started about a year ago with an orientation, and any new owner has to have an orientation where we review. How much have you read? What are you familiar with? What have you asked? Do you have any questions about anything? And if they say, oh, sure, then of course it's very easy when they do something that's outside of those documents. We can say, excuse me, you violated this, this, and this in the bylaw and whatever. Did you really read the documents? And they usually say no, but it gets them to go back. And it's really important. We've had situations internally where we've really had to go back and look at the governing documents. And we actually made some changes because they were 35 years old and they didn't fit the current environment. So we went through the process, and it took about 6 months, 8 months, something like that. And we did get it changed. So the governing documents are vital to all of these relationships. Okay. All right, let's look at, all right, here we go. We had the self-managed, which was a direct relationship, and the managed. Now, managed communities are interesting because if you've got a board, especially if you've got an engaged board, everybody's going to want to make changes. And what we had to do is we had to put into place here a situation where, okay, who can ask management for what? So that we didn't have every director going to the manager saying, I need this, I need that, I need that. We have one or two who do, but everything they ask for has to go through me first. So that's one kind of thing. Managed is a matter of, as we said, the clear communication. Who's going to be the liaison? Usually in the case of the management, if you have a management company, they would be the ones to have all the one-on-ones with the vendor. It becomes more professional, and it's a situation where you don't lose track of, well, he said this to that one and that to that one. No, you have one line of communication that goes down the line. And that seems to work pretty well. Brian?
Yeah. And here we're going to talk a little bit about the communication pathways, how that information gets conveyed to your expert and who's got the authority. And this is the legal concept of authority and apparent authority comes into play a good bit here, because just like Vicki said, all of those board members may one day wake up and say, oh, I need to tell that landscaper something. They do it differently, or they didn't do it right, or I want them to do more. And so they're going to call that landscaper directly. But do they have the authority to do that? Has the board talked about that? Are they that proper liaison? And so establishing that with each of your contractors and among your board is essential. It's absolutely important, because the potential results are, first of all, you can incur additional billing or fees. If they instruct your landscaper to do something different, if they ask your attorney to give it an opinion that the board didn't really want, any of those things can incur additional costs to the association. And of course, if the board hasn't voted on that instruction, hasn't given it to the contractor, then there are a host of problems in terms of if it incurs any liability for the association and whether or not the insurance will even cover it. If a director is acting outside their authority, then does the director and authority, the director and officer of DNO policy, is it going to kick in? Is it going to cover that issue? So for self-managed boards, obviously they're going to communicate directly with that expert or with that contractor. And so the question is one completely of apparent authority and actual authority, and being clear about that and saying, this is our person. If you hear from him or her, you are entitled to act, you are authorized to act. Nobody else has the authority to instruct you. Most contractors who work in the community association industry understand that individual owners, whether they be homeowners or unit owners, don't have the authority to instruct them. But if there's a confusion or question about whether or not a board member has authority, they might understandably act incorrectly. So make sure you're clear there. And from the managed perspective, there are the whole spectrum exists in my experience in terms of how you're going to communicate. I'll use attorneys because I happen to be one. And so we've had clients over the years who I talk with the board directly all the time. And they come directly to me and they want to speak to the attorney because they're the client. They want to know, they want to give me all the information I need to know. They want to make sure that if they have any follow-up questions or anything they want to ask, that can be done. Have the entire, the inverse completely, where they say, talk to us through the manager. Manager is going to contact you when we need you. They'll let you know, and then they'll forward what you tell him or her back to us. And then there's everything in between. You can have a single liaison. You can have a board member who's going to contact the expert on certain issues. But that issue of authority and letting that expert know, letting that contractor know who they're entitled to listen to, and then who they need to ask a question. If they hear from someone else to say, hold on, wait a minute, this isn't the person that I'm supposed to hear from, to pump those brakes a little bit and make sure that that's right. Phil, did you want to help us out?
I just wanted to add one thing to what Brian said for the managed. We do have, and if you've got someone, for instance, we do have an on-site manager, and she has learned that there are board members who will call her or stop in and say, well, we need to do this, this, and this. And once again, she's aware of the way things are supposed to be done, the communication, and she'll drop me a quick email and say, so-and-so stopped in to do this and said, we need to do this, this, and this. I need to contact this person. Is it okay with you? So basically, she's following up on that hierarchy. And it works well with us because then the person, the director who made the request, doesn't feel insulted. They may know that she's going to do it. They may not think she's going to do it, but she does it. And I'll say yes. And if it's a no, then I'll say, okay, I'll handle it. Or she'll say, no, I think I can handle it. So it's really important to make sure that there is a line of communication that's specified. And it's the same with homeowners. They may call in and want something done, and she'll call me and say, what do you think? And I said, we'll put it on for the next board workshop and discuss it, that kind of thing. So it gets done eventually, but we're still following in the lines of communication, and everybody is aware of everything that's going on.
Brian, you mentioned that you've seen kind of all, like across the spectrum of different types on how this works. is there one that you have found that works the best, or is it as long as it's clearly communicated what the pathway is, then it seems to work?
I think that it's very much board specific, and I really encourage boards to kind of think of this, because a lot of the time as you join a board, you'll say, well, this is how we've always done it. We send our stuff straight to the manager and they send it to the attorney, or the opposite. We always talk to this attorney all the time about every single issue, and that's how it's done. And potentially you want to re-examine and say, geez, this is too much volume. We don't need to talk to all the time. We can keep it to our once monthly meeting and send a report or get a report. Or the inverse. We can say, it's kind of turning into a game of telephone through the manager, whereas we have a bunch of follow-up questions we should communicate directly with our attorney. Obviously, I'm using my specific example as an attorney, but I think the answer holds across different contractors, where you can say, handle this for us, go ahead and take care of this for us, and act out our wishes, be our arm as you're supposed to be, please, Mr. or Ms. Manager. Or the opposite, you can say, we want to talk to this person because we want to make sure that they're hearing our voice, that we get to ask any follow-up questions that we have, and the communication is good. So I don't have, and I don't really steer associations toward any particular preference. I think they should evaluate their needs and adjust as necessary.
Thanks.
All right, so when should we think about bidding or bidding out or changing our advisors? My mic good? Yep. All right. As Vicki pointed out earlier, first thing you got to look at is the governing documents. There might be something in there requiring you to bid certain things out every certain number of years, and so that's helpful. When bidding out the insurance, I'll throw out there that sometimes insurance agencies can bid your insurance with multiple carriers, which might check that box. So you may not necessarily, you may find yourself, where you have a good relationship with that agent, and then they can bid out multiple carriers. So that can be helpful. I think you may know when a change is necessary. Maybe you had a bad experience. Maybe the performance isn't, maybe they're not, meeting the standard that you set. Remember, your RFP required certain things. If they're not meeting those requirements that you had, then, maybe it's time to go to the market and see what else, or maybe go back to the original group that you looked at and consider another one, or bid everything out, to new advisors. Obviously, outside factors could change. Maybe your favorite CSR or CPA moved to a different firm, and so you might have to consider that. I think that accountability is very key, and that goes back to the RFP, because if you've told them what you expect, what you need, then you have to go back and make sure they're meeting those objectives that you set for them, and that's going to help you decide really when you should think about it. The budget has a lot to do with it. I mean, if the costs are going up every year, as insurance tends to do, sometimes it can get out of control. I mean, if things are not affordable, well, then there's no better reason to shop. I think we do that all with our home budgets as well. And the bottom line is, it's kind of common sense stuff. If we've asked them to do something and they're not doing it, then we need to hold them accountable, and go in and shop at that point.
We've got an example that actually you could take all the way back to the RFP. We had a vendor for years. I mean, since long before I ever moved here. And as years went on, the vendor kept getting more expensive, and we felt we were being overcharged on a lot of things. And every time we looked at their contract, it was like we couldn't find a way to get out of it. There was absolutely no way. And normally you'd say, well, you let it expire. Well, somehow at some point, somebody had built in, probably the vendor, an automatic renewal every 5 years. The problem being, we didn't know what the renewal date was. It wasn't in there. So this thing kept renewing itself and we couldn't get out of it. Eventually, we pinned down the renewal date. Our attorney wound up sending termination letters to this vendor every single week until we could get them to say, oh yeah, that's the right one. And we got out of it. So, I mean, but the thing is, we're going to go back to the RFP. If at the point in time when that contract was initially signed, there had been an RFP, there wouldn't have been any question. We would have known how to get out of it. And this was performance everything. I mean, they ticked every box for why we wanted to get rid of them. But it took us about 1.5 years to actually get out of the contract. But we did. And it took our attorney, our management company, we were all working on this. And I would like to know, I really should look at who wrote that original contract. They might come in handy for some things. But, and the thing is, you also, if you change your vendor, you may feel that a change is necessary, but before you actually do it, you need to be sure. We made a change in a vendor and we thought it was going to be fabulous. And the first 2 times that we used the new vendor, it was great. But then it was like, wait a second, we're getting nickel and dimed. And we actually wound up going back to our old vendor because they provided a more consistent service than the new one. So when you're thinking, you really have to seriously think about changing. You know, what is it that you don't like about them? Can you sit down and discuss with them what you'd like to change? And that's probably the better way of doing it than just going out and taking bids on something else.
And I think Matt kind of hit that point earlier as well. And when you're considering switching any kind of vendor, especially somebody really involved in the process, like your management company, there's an opportunity cost and loss just in that process, regardless of, even if you're going to hire the new best, greatest management company that just came down, you know, out of the sky and is perfect and flawless and shiny. Just getting all your stuff over to them, just getting everything started, just getting that person caught up to speed so that they understand what you're doing. There is a differential, there is an opportunity cost there. And I'm not sure, you know, if I described Matt's company, but that company, you know, a lot of those, you know, when you start up with somebody new, there's a time process where they get caught back up. Whereas if you talk to your vendor, whoever it is, attorney, insurance, anything, you say, look, I don't think we're getting what we need here. There's a decent chance, especially if you've gone through this process at the outset, if you did your RFP, if you vetted these contractors, if you brought this person on board, and you say, look, now I want to switch. I don't think so. Think back for a second and figure out what brought you to them in the first place and see if you can repair that and say, hey, let's go back to where we started and steer the ship down the right path this time. A lot of the time that's worth it. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but it's usually at least worth considering for a board.
Before we move on, Brian or Phil, have you had any experience? So here we're kind of talking about bidding and changing. I know some communities, even when things are good, they bid to just kind of see, you know, what's out there. Is it still a good time or still a good situation that they're in? But then there's the downside of, I've heard from other business partners where communities are kind of constantly reaching out for bids, but they're not really looking to change. They're just kind of getting the lay of the land. Have you had that experience, or how do you, I guess, kind of handle that maybe as a business partner, but also Matt, as a manager of communities who want to kind of constantly be bidding and seeing the price and the possibility of working with other business partners?
I definitely see it. But at the same time, you can't tell the difference, unless it's year after year after year and you're never winning. And, I tend to take a little bit different approach by, setting up like, look, if I can do X, Y, and Z, is there going to be anything that keeps me from, earning your business? But at the end of the day, I'm still going to end up doing that proposal. I'm not gonna say no. Is it? And I don't think it's necessarily a waste of time on the association's part either to bid it out every year. I mean, once for like in my business, once it's entered into the system, once we get it all set up, bidding it out isn't that difficult. We just resubmit after it's set up the first time. So the insurance, I mean, I don't mind it when our associations are like, hey, every year, I want you to bid this out with, it happens far more often with condos because the premiums are so much larger than the smaller homeowners associations. I would say that it might benefit you to if you have a large condo where there's that much building coverage to have your agent bid it for you every single year, because it is that much premium, and the markets are getting harder out there. There's fewer carriers, and the premiums are continuing to rise for condominiums. So yeah, that's a good point. Smaller homeowners associations, I don't know if you might be wasting your time. I mean, there's especially if there isn't a lot of property. If it's just the general liability and directors and officers, 20 to 50 units total, you're not, even if you found 10% savings, it's not, it's maybe 60, 70, $80, $100 a year, right? Whereas 10% savings on a condo with multiple buildings, that can be $10,000 a year. So good question.
Yeah, so we manage a couple of properties where even within their documents, there's requirements to bid out for certain vendors yearly or with other timeframes. And what we try to do as managing agent, or even as a board of directors, be as transparent as possible with these vendors and let them know what the process is. Whether it be that you need to bid out yearly for your landscaping contract or something else, as long as you're clear with the vendors and your business partners about what's happening, why we're going out for bids or why they didn't actually get the bid after providing a proposal. We found that in this industry that almost all business partners are very understanding. If you're clear and give a real good reason on why that vendor wasn't selected, there usually is not any hard feelings. That really brings us into the process of what happens if you are bidding or if you actually have to move to a new vendor. No matter what the reason, what we try to instill in our communities is, if you do need to make a change or if you do need to bid out, make sure that if you are severing a tie with a business partner, that you're doing it in a professional manner, that you're not really burning any bridges. Because Vicki even gave the example for her community where they went with a new vendor for a year or two and didn't work out, and then they went back to an old expert that they work with. So making sure that you are severing ties in a professional manner so that you can go back to those business partners is really, really important.
To go along with Matt, I think that if you've got several vendors and you're looking at them all and you've decided against one, the best thing to do is to go directly to them and say, this is why we're not going to go with you. In some cases, they will say, okay, and we did this recently with a contract. We had it narrowed down to 3 vendors, and we had some issues with one of them. And we really went back and said, okay, we're down to 3. This is our issue with you. Is there anything these are our issues or issue. Is there anything that you can do to possibly change that in the proposal? And they did. It still wasn't enough, but they understood where we were coming from. Sometimes they will change something and say, oh, okay, this works. So this now fits into what we're looking for. So it's always the best practice to be absolutely honest with those vendors, why you're letting them go or why you're not considering their proposal, because you never know when something's going to happen, like happened with us, where we did the one switch and it just didn't work out. And we went back to the other one because we had left them and said we needed to switch for this reason. So we went back, we renegotiated, and they said, okay, we'll do this instead of that. And we went back to them. So you need to be honest. You just can't ignore somebody and say, well, we just decided to go with somebody else. You need to tell them why, because you never know when you're going to have to go back to them.
So I got a great question from an owner here, or someone that maybe a board member, regarding the quality of work due to the labor force deficit that's been happening for the last 2 years due to COVID, which is a fantastic question. For some of the properties that we've managed, we've seen a direct decline, specifically in our landscaping quality in terms of the availability of qualified workers in that industry, whether it has to do with a deficit in labor force or just the ability to get qualified personnel on properties. We've had a couple of communities that have had long-standing relationships with landscapers. I'm talking 15, 20 years, that were ready to make a change this year due to the quality of work. And what we had to do was actually sit down with higher ups within those industries to talk about them and get real honest answers from them. Generally, if you talk to someone once or twice about something, they'll say, oh, we'll get it cleaned up, we'll get it taken care of. But really, this was a pattern over several months of just not quality work, and we're not getting what we paid for. We sat down with the landscaping company, we sat down with the higher ups, and they were very honest about what was going on. They just don't have the qualified people to do the work. In addition to that, with manual labor, there's an issue with getting materials. So everything has really been compounded on itself because of the lack of workforce. But that company was very clear with the board. They were very honest about what was going on. The board was understanding, and really because of those discussions with that expert, they were able to maintain the relationship, and really the expectations were set to a more realistic standard of what everyone's really going through right now. And really, that's an important thing to make sure you have with your experts is honesty on both ends. Not only does the board need to be honest with the expert, but the expert needs to be honest with the board on what services they can provide. So this year, 2020 and 2021, absolutely, there was a quality of work issue with a couple of our industries that we had to address. Now, if you do get to a point where everyone's decided, the managing agent or the board or whomever, that a change needs to be made with an expert, there's several things that need to happen at one time. The first being, and Vicki alluded to this in one of their contracts, is how to get out of a contract with an expert and the language within it. Generally, with most contracts, depending on how they're written, there's a time frame where you need to give a termination, or there's a clause in there that'll allow you to get out of that contract. But before you enter into that portion of the contract or into that clause, you need to make sure as an association that you have someone able to take over for that service that you all are taking care of. So there's a couple of things you need to juggle, whether it being the board or the managing agent that you've given direction to. To give an example, if you have something in a building, let's say you have a boiler room service or an elevator service, which is pertinent to your building or your community functioning properly, you cannot terminate that contract with that expert until you have another expert lined up and make sure that they're able to get in there and take care of things. You want to make sure that you're not just terminating quickly and not having these services available to you. And a lot of times you'll need to go to an outside source to make sure that this termination process, as well as the new contract that you're signing, are really vetted properly. The majority of the time, the answer that we give our communities is, if you're having a major contract change, to give it to your attorney. You want an attorney to take a look at the language. Back to Vicki's example, because that contract had an auto renew and no termination clause, if they didn't have an attorney vetted properly, take a look at it, they could have been stuck in a cycle with that expert for years and years. So the number one thing that we have our communities do if it's a major change, whether it's managing agent, some other massive service that you have years of experience with an expert with, we have the attorney look over the contract. Same thing with larger projects. If it's a one-time project, let's say you're doing foundation work on a building, and you want to make sure the language within that contract is taking care of the association. So the first thing that we will have communities do is get the bid together, get the contract together, and then have the attorney review. If the attorney gives it the go-ahead, the board's giving it the go-ahead, and the managing agent's giving it the go-ahead, that's when you start the process of terminating the expert that you're working with. You want to make sure that both the board and your managing agent, if you are managed, terminate the work with that expert in a very professional manner. Like we alluded to earlier, you do not want to burn any bridges in the industry because you never know when you're going to have to do that. In the instance where you don't, if you are a managed property and you have to, let's say you have to want to make a change in managing it, sometimes communities have to do that. Brian spoke about this earlier. That is a pretty major undertaking. If you're a managed community, your managing agent not only has all of your records and information for all of your homeowners, but they probably facilitate the majority of your day-to-day work. So getting that change done is a rather large undertaking for a board. And a lot of times they'll have to lean on their legal counsel on how to get that done. Usually if a managing agent's terminated, they're not super thrilled to help facilitate that. So the board of directors will have to develop an RFP. They'll have to interview with other managing agents. And that's something that can be very tough. So having other experts in the industry that you can speak to that have knowledge of it, whether it be an insurance person or attorney or someone else, that can be very, very helpful in an instance like this. And then finally, again, if you're a very active community, hopefully the board will be very involved with the process. But we have managed some properties where the board puts all of the onus on the manager. Hey, we've selected a bid, terminate this expert, bring on the other one, just let us know when it's done. And in those instances, sometimes we try to get feedback from the board that we can give to the experts and let them know, hey, here's the reason that we have for the termination, whether it's quality of work or if it's pricing, or the board just wanted to make a change. We try to give all of our industry experts that we work with some kind of feedback directly from the board to let them know why the decision is. Because I think sometimes there's a confusion where experts or people within the industry think that a change has been facilitated by the management company. And I want to make sure that everyone on here knows that all of the experts that work for the community work for the community. Managing agent, your attorney, your insurance company, they all are working for the association. Ultimately, the decisions that are made that need for any change, whatever it may be, falls on the board of directors. So I want to make sure that the people that we work with in the industry are clear that the board's making this decision. It's not based off of something that happens either for the manager or the attorney, that the board of directors ultimately made a decision. And here's why. So we make sure we're very clear with everyone on why these changes need to be made. And then finally, if we are to make a change and the change has been facilitated, we as a managing agent and people as a board of directors need to make sure it's budgeted correctly. So Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. So obviously budget is one of the more important things that all associations have to deal with. And changing of your experts or people that you work with in the industry, they have a huge impact on them. To give an example, again, leaning back on Vicky's property, because she's on the call this evening, or this morning, we had a change in a vendor for a service that they've used for a very long time. It was probably a 10 or 15% increase because we thought we were getting better services for that said thing. So we had to make sure that we budgeted for it properly when we were going into this new contract. So in addition to juggling all of the things, terminating an expert, but you need to make sure that when you are going to a new service, that you are fully budgeting for it. Part of that, again, harkening back to the RFP, making sure that that's very clear language within your contracts on everything that you're going to spend. So to give the example of landscaping, there may be a set price for X, Y, and Z, but your community wants other services. You need to make sure that you properly budget. Brian, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to hit the one there at the bottom that says, don't look at last year and add 10%. And this is really important for a lot of your professional services. And I can certainly speak to it from the legal angle because a lot of different things can happen. You know, one year you can be involved in major litigation. The next year, not a whole lot of legal issues come up or arise. Everything goes fairly smoothly. One year you are rewriting your bylaws and taking on a big undertaking or setting out a whole new policy and rules and regulations and everything else like that. So it's, and we're not just saying add more than 10% necessarily. We on occasion, you'll see it go down. You'll say, hey, look, last year we spent more than what we were budgeted for, but here's a distinct reason why. So we don't need to double our budget just because we went over last year. We need to acknowledge that that happened, but also say we were right at the time. Some new factors came up and changed during that budget season that made it incorrect. As we look back, we spent a little more, we went over budget, but those factors are not unique, or sorry, they are unique to last year, and they're not going to repeat themselves. So when you're budgeting for that professional advice, don't just say, what did we spend last year? Stick on an extra 10%. Take a few minutes to figure out if there's a reason why you were above budget, if you came in under budget, and what you might be able to expect for the following year.
Absolutely. And we also have some business partners that we work with that are very helpful in the budgeting process, where they'll provide information very early on in the year about pricing and things that are going to affect their bottom line moving into next year. To give an example, a pool management company for the association. It's a seasonal thing. It only happens a couple of months. But over the last couple of years, due to immigration law changes and minimum wage changes, prices for that service have gone up pretty substantially. And our business partners have been very clear with the managing agents as well as the boards on the reasons for those increases. And we're seeing that kind of across the board with all of the services that we work with, where if they foresee something pretty exponential happening in terms of their costs, they'll provide that to the board so that you all can budget accordingly in terms of what those services cost. And then there's some other things like Brian alluded to, where you need to look at the last couple of years and kind of see if there's a pattern or a correlation there on how to budget these things. So it is an undertaking, and usually what we try to make sure our associations do is we're constantly looking at our budget. We're looking at next year's budget. And the review of our contracts with our services is a major part of that. Any questions there, Stephen?
I don't think so. I think that wraps up the presentation for today. So we have a few minutes. If folks have any questions for the panel or wanted to share any experiences that you've had as far as your business professionals, we have a few minutes. So folks are welcome to unmute or toss them into the chat. While anyone's doing that, I'll go ahead and remind everybody that we will have a follow-up email that will have the contact information for the speakers today. So if you have follow-up questions, you'll be able to reach out to them directly. We'll also include a link for the video recording. So if there's anything you wanted to go back, if you might have missed a part and go back and rewatch, we'll provide that as well as the slides that were used today. So you have those for your use as well. So again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in. And otherwise, I think we are all set. Please help me in thanking our speakers again. Thank you all for being here this morning. Our speakers volunteered their time to develop the program and also give it to our members. So thank you all. Thanks, Brian, Vicki, Matt, and Phil. And thank you for attending today. Thanks, everybody.